5 years and has held senior positions in blood centres, carbon fractionation manufacturers in government and in regulatory and policy agencies. He served on international bodies including the WHO, the Council of Europe, the WFH and the US and European Commission.
Just a second, we've got a problem here.
I'll keep going.
Go ahead. Okay, all right.
Okay. All right?
We're good.
Just
before we start, I'll get these slides.
As a member of the global leading tourist community and advocates for access to treatment for people with rare chronic diseases. He claims to be a postal and military historian, a passionate follower of music and politics, and an amateur artist. And before we started, I Googled translated Faruja from the Maltese, and it's very difficult to get any sense out of it whatsoever. Albert tells me it means a nice man who doesn't mean any harm, which suggests he's a doctor.
I don't know what we're supposed to do, Willie, because young Brooker has just given me what was supposed to be the first thing, which is to ask people questions and get them to answer. So what will we do? I mean, shall we do this first, or shall we just go on, or whatever? Irrespective of anything, I've got 30 minutes. Oh yes, here it is. Okay, so as usual, now let me try to remember how this goes. As usual at this gig, from its inception, we have these question and answer sessions, which are great fun. And you're supposed to use your device. You know, Mark, I really think you should come up here. You're supposed to use your device in order to answer these questions, and probably later on you will be challenged with questions which you will have to answer twice, depending on the extent to which the various speakers will have brainwashed you. So what do we do now? So come up here, dear boy. Come up here.
So the first one's really just a question to make sure everyone has their voting pads functioning. When I say vote, you'll have 10 seconds to register an answer to the question. Not counting this one, how many global forums have you attended? So start voting. It's okay. I can't vote either.
We are disenfranchised.
Yes.
Just as long as you are disenfranchised 2 days ago.
Okay.
And thank you, Willie. Willie's an old friend, and thank you very much for introducing me. And I just want to reflect that about 10 days ago, I put a link to this event on my Facebook page. Yes, I've got one. And at that time, I was following events in this country, as is my wont, with great interest, and I stated in this link that if indeed something extraordinary did happen before the forum, I would acknowledge it in the event itself. And just as I was here in this WFH writing the regulatory guide in September of 2000 when Pierre Trudeau, because now we have to specify, we can't say Trudeau anymore, died, and I remember feeling the emotion which swept across this usually quiet and stoic country. And just as I was in the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, the night the first Harper government was elected, and I couldn't sleep as the Tory apparatchiks trashed their rooms in joy, I just want to acknowledge the fact that I'm very happy to be in Canada at this time. What follows is a very personal retrospective. I am by now quite accustomed to young Brooker emailing me or calling me feverishly 2 or 3 weeks before the forum and expanding my remit, which he did a few weeks ago from 1 to 3 talks. And this, as I said, is a very personal retrospective on the issues of safety and supply. These are my disclosures. Anybody willing and able to help me expand them is welcome to contact me after the talk. And I'm going to start with some safety updates. First, we will look at some of the things we think we understand. Don't know that we do, but we think we understand them. Viruses. This is the latest source, I think, in terms of the conventional virus aspects, which gives us some reason to speculate. It is yet another hepatitis virus. It is mostly transmitted parenterally. If you are a blood donor in the south of France, chances are that you will have been infected by this virus because it is mostly passaged through pigs. And in those parts of the world where they eat practically anything, like in the south of France, you are most likely to have acquired the infection, and unless you are sick in other ways, you will have cleared it. But you can see from the perspective of possibly doing anything about the blood safety side that given that there is an increasingly high level of infectivity in normal blood donors, this is not so easily. Of interest and concern to us in this community, this is a non-enveloped virus, which means it's not going to be easy to kill it, and we are aware of studies still being done by the industry. To summarize, therefore, it is enterally transmitted, as I said, but it is also transmitted parenterally, and it is definitely transmissible through blood transfusion. There are some very well-described case studies in the literature. It is a bad thing to get it if you are an immunosuppressed patient, such as transplant patients or people who are on cancer chemotherapy. In these types of patients, you can get an evolution to cirrhosis which goes up to 50%. There is, in my opinion, as I scan the literature, relative uncertainty regarding to infection in hemophilia. For example, a paper from Israel indicated that the percentage infectivity in people with hemophilia was not higher than the normal population, whereas a subsequent study in North Africa, I think it might have been Tunisia, although I might be mistaken, indicated that the epidemiology suggests some differential transmission. Be that as it may, we are of course interested in what this virus does during fractionation, and there are some indications, although in my opinion not very strong, and given that this is non-enveloped, I like to view the situation with some level of caution, that the viral activation procedures, which we do have in fact now, are able to clear the virus. And I think mostly the fact that it is relatively small and non-enveloped lends itself to some level of barrier from nanofiltration. Let's talk about the British disease. This seems, despite the projections and sometimes I used to think hopes of the VCJD industry, to be approaching an end. There are very, very few cases since we met last, and you can see the breakdown there. This is what I could extract in public information, but I do not believe there's been much change since the end of 2011. In the United Kingdom, I know that Willie will get into this aspect of our field later, so I'll leave that to him to contradict me if that is indeed the case. Worldwide as well, the number of cases is remaining small and relatively stable. But we know that prions with us are here to stay. I'll just reiterate the single case we saw in a person with hemophilia. This was not an actual disease case. It was somebody who, upon post-mortem examination for unrelated causes, was shown to have been infected through examination of the spleen. There you have the relevant Western blots. I myself cannot understand how you can conclude from these things, but I'm not an expert because they all look the same to me. But it is the case that this patient received factor VIII manufactured in the United Kingdom from plasma, which was subsequently shown to have included a donor with VCJD. We know that the product which this patient had, which was manufactured from this implicated plasma, was the concentrate known as 8Y, otherwise an excellent product which has served the community in England and worldwide for many, many years. We know that the clearance of prions in this process is actually modest by the standards we hold the industry to these days, especially versus other higher purity products available from the same manufacturer. It is of interest that a patient with primary immune deficiency receiving similarly implicated product, which was intravenous immunoglobulin, again from a donor who was subsequently diagnosed with VCJD did not get infected. We all know that the process of clearance for cone-manufactured immunoglobulin in relation to prions is very high. We rely, as I emphasize every time I speak about these things, on clearance. B19, I will take the bull by the horns. There are a number of measures in place. They have certainly decreased the risk. Have they eliminated it? This is a paper, a somewhat complex table from a paper some time ago showing the incidence of nucleic acid for B19 in batches of factor concentrate in what I would call the post-inactivation era, the era in which we have introduced measures. We have introduced, for example, the NAT testing in pools of plasma. This is now an industry standard, has been for some years. We have introduced various viral inactivation and elimination steps which can deal with the virus. We still see in this paper some products showing evidence of viral presence, if not infectivity. I'm very glad that we have Mike here with us, and perhaps he would like to comment later on. This is one of Mike Soucy's several studies on parvovirus B19, one of the most recent ones. And what you see here is the progression of infectivity in patients in various age groups relative to people who have not received any factor concentrate. And you can see on the basis of this data, which caused a flurry of interaction in the relevant journal between Mike and the people who commented, that patients with hemophilia who did receive plasma-derived product lie outside the 95% confidence interval of the non-exposed population, suggesting that it is unfortunately the case that we are still seeing some infectivity. On the other hand, B19, human parvovirus B19, is not as tough as we initially thought on the basis of animal models. And we know that apart from what we can do for factor 9, for example, with nanofiltration, even with factor 8, heat treatment, dry heat treatment, particularly at 80 degrees in the final vial, does have some effect. So the situation is not bad, but we still have cause for some concern. And I myself think that the question of non-enveloped viruses in particular still challenges us as an industry, and we must not let go of our efforts in order to continue. Now let's say something about some new things, and I'm indebted to Mark for much of this information because I didn't have the faintest idea that these things were happening. We actually have a new prion disease, ladies and gentlemen. And this is reported relatively recently in the literature, previously thought to be simply a variant of Parkinson's disease. This is multiple system atrophy and has been characterized by Prusner's group as actually being a new transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. It does appear, relative to other models and Parkinson's disease itself, to have a higher level of infectivity in animal models. Is this a problem? I would like to think that it is not. The capacity of the processes, as far as we can do it, which isn't really all that much, I have to tell you, but all that can be done has and is continuing to be done, is that prions are cleared effectively. And to paraphrase something which I heard again from this country 3 nights ago, in relation to prions and clearance, a prion is a prion is a prion. And therefore, all prions are actually cleared very effectively. So we would expect that this very rare and somewhat mysterious disorder is not going to prove to be a problem to our community, but prions are with us and will stay, and we need to continue our efforts. A very interesting paper, again, I was made aware by Mark of this rather smart group of people who've published before, and it is interesting because they use the kind of blanket genomic analysis, as far as I can understand. I'm an old man, you see, and I grew up in the era when biochemistry meant you could do SDS page manually. I have no idea how these things are done, but these guys found by scanning the virome of the normal human blood that they could find a new transmissible virus which has shared features with, in fact, things like hepatitis C. And they found 2 patients with hemophilia showing evidence of infectivity. Now, I hasten to tell you that these patients were from the multi-center hemophilia cohort study, which is now what I would call a venerable cohort. And I am pleased to see equally venerable participants in this study looking at me from the audience. But I do not think that this is a source of concern, and the main reason isn't the fact that it is an old situation. It is because this virus is actually an enveloped virus, and in all honesty, I do not think that for enveloped viruses we need to have any doubt at all that the current viral inactivation processes are indeed fully effective. But now I want to indulge, as is somewhat my wont, in some more general philosophizing, and I will start by drawing your attention to this paper, which was published some 25 years ago by the FDA group. First author was Tom Lynch, who subsequently, like me, abandoned ship and went to the industry. But what this study shows is the inexorable reality of the imposition of plasma pool size on the potential infectivity of plasma-derived products. We need to have large plasma pools for a number of reasons: logistics, GMP, yield, and so on. There's no question of that. But the reality is that as soon as we exceed a relatively modest pool size, any infection which is sneaking into the blood supply without notice, and most of the infections in the past 20 years have been exactly of that kind, will manifest, and unless we do something pre and in advance, we will have infected patients. And to make 3 points, I would say that blood safety will always constitute unpredictable, non-linear events. I will explain this in the subsequent slide. And we have to counter this through pathogen inactivation and pathogen reduction. This is a paradigm which is totally established for our sector now. It is unfortunately still being resisted at various levels in the whole blood sector and in the transfusion sector, and the sooner that this is accepted, the better it is, and the panicking and the usual frenzies when anything ranging from Ebola to chikungunya comes up will probably be avoided. Now, the finely chiseled features of my chair is on this slide because I heard him make these points many years ago in a conference in New Zealand, and that is Murphy's laws in relation to linear and nonlinear analysis. We can tell the future from the past, that's a linear form of analysis, and we cannot tell the future from the past, which is non-linear, non-deterministic, and in fact chaotic. He's also published a paper on this, which I recommend you to read. It's one of the things which I always keep up my sleeve. But when you think about it, this is a review I wrote some years ago on blood safety and the effect of globalization. These are the 3 scenarios, ladies and gentlemen, which describe the entrance of HIV, variant CJD, and West Nile virus into the blood supply. Somewhat colored language, but I've always thought that these would have made excellent plots for science fantasy movies and books like those of one of my favorite authors, who you can see over here. Only it just so happens that truth is stranger than fiction. So anybody who would have posed these scenarios as being threats to hemophilia safety and the blood supply years ago would have been classified as a nutcase, and yet it happened. Here is a slide which everybody has had, the very promiscuous slide, and we keep showing this, the emerging, re-emerging, and deliberately emerging infections around the globe. I don't know that I'm actually pressing this thing, I'll go back. As we, as human beings, do our best to manipulate the planet, and in our pursuit of greed, change and destroy the environment, and do things which obviously alter the balance of nature, to put it simplistically, and lead to these outcomes. This is a fascinating paper. I won't go into it. I've only just found it a few weeks ago. It's about my country, and it shows the history of infection and infectious disease in Australia over the course of white settlement and urbanization in what was a totally, or practically totally naive continent. And many infections have emerged in Australia, and they are described in this paper, and speculation is posed in relation to how things happened, and I'll just list a few of them there. Despite my best efforts when I was a regulator, the Queensland government continues to refuse to classify northern Queensland as an endemic zone for dengue. This despite the fact that dengue appears every year. I do not know what they think is endemic. It's as endemic as it could be. And I can remember the resistance which the Blood Service put up about 15 years ago when, in the absence at that time of transmission, I insisted that if blood can be a vehicle for West Nile and other flaviviruses, then it can be a vehicle for dengue, and we needed to take steps, which we did. We were actually the first country in the world. But as I said, they weren't very enthusiastic about that. Subsequent events have, I think, sobered them and the rest of the community. And both dengue and the Ross River virus, and all these things are transmissible by blood. And here's my favorite, the one which is transmitted, it's a rabies-like disease, practically lethal in every case, which is transmitted by flying marsupials, fruit bats, we call them, ugly beasts, and you don't want them near your house. And all of these are penetrating more and more into the environment as we manipulate it. And so this is an interesting case study of the kind of issues which are unpredictable, as I said. But we do see always hope for our side of the fence relative to the blood sector, because, not for any other reason other than because we have viral activation. We haven't seen a single HIV, I think, from, again, Mike Susi's survey since the mid-80s, whereas occasionally, despite NAT testing and all the other bells and whistles, we see it in the transfused components, and the same occurs for relatively newer infections like West Nile virus. Because pathogen reduction processes, I dare say, stand to be corrected by my learned share, but I think there is an element of linearity, there is an element of predictability in terms particularly of envelope viruses, so that while the models which we have established can predict efficacy, we always find it confirmed when we use the actual viruses in these experiments. So this is something which should keep us always in a level of cautious optimism. Let me say something about supply. You all know this kind of curve. We have a continuous increase, greatly happily, in the global supply as the demand increases. Despite this, 3/4 of the community is still deprived of therapy around the world. So let's talk about how we can increase and look at this availability. First of all, from blood. Well, we need plasma. How much plasma? What drives the plasma industry, as we all know now, is not our needs. What drives the plasma industry is intravenous and other types of administered immunoglobulin. On the basis of modeling studies, and you can discuss the accuracy of this, but it is the case that the United States, Canada, and Australia have now exceeded 200 grams per 1,000 population, and a yield of about 4 grams per liter of plasma, which I think most fractionators would aspire to. We can come down to 37.5 liter of plasma need per 1,000, and if we fractionate it with current factor rate processes, we will get also 7.5 IUs per capita of factor rate. So that's an interesting bit of back-of-the-envelope calculation to reflect. But where is this plasma going to come from? Can be recovered from blood donations, which has been the case for the traditional voluntary-based sector, or from plasmapheresis. If we get it from recovered plasma and we pack 95% of the blood, and this is something on which I have strong views, which I will not bore you with, we will need to collect 126 units of whole blood per 1,000 population. Can't do it, impossible. Besides which, the amount of blood collected and used is actually decreasing. We are going through the era, thankfully, of patient blood management, which is resulting in the global financial crisis of the developed blood sector in the world, in the developed world, as the amount of blood used decreases, and the economics of this impacts on the so-called not-for-profit sector. This is just an example from the United States. But again, if you look at my country, the amount of red cells used is decreasing rapidly. There's that rapid trend. The amount of immunoglobulin used keeps going up. And despite the fact that we have a high level of plasma for fractionation generated, 2/3 of which comes from, 40% of which comes from whole blood, 60% of which comes from apheresis, we still have not got a coverage of the total current demand by the domestic blood supply. And let me just emphasize that Australia is committed to self-sufficiency, but not to rationing patients. So this is being done despite our best efforts. And as I'll show in a later slide, our best efforts are actually very good. So if we look at global plasma collection, you can see the trend over the years here, that the vast bulk of plasma collected is from the commercial sector, and the vast majority of this is in the form of source plasma, and that much of this source plasma is coming from paid donors, mostly in the United States of America. About 1 million individual donors in that country are responsible for nearly 2/3 of the plasma derivative supply in the world. Think about it. Think what will happen if those people weren't there, or if something were to knock them out of the system, just as the British donors were knocked out about 20 years ago. This is a slide which summarizes all of this stuff. Incidentally, as usual, is from Patrick Robert. I don't know if he's in the audience, but as is my wont, I salute his unremitting efforts to get us data. And you can see that the top 10 plasma producers, the top 4 are suppliers which generate plasma through compensated and uncompensated routes. My country has the proud honor, as a result of massive government investment in plasmapheresis and switching blood donors to plasmapheresis in the uncompensated sector. But you can see how much most countries, especially those who do not access paid plasma, lag behind those thresholds which I gave you earlier. But this isn't only, and in fact for most countries in the developed world, this isn't where we get our coagulation factors. And now I will say something about the new scenario, perhaps for the first time in the context of availability. We are increasingly gratified at the large number of coagulation factor concentrates available to us. For old men like me, who can remember the days when maybe we had 2 or 3 concentrates, all of which were fairly similar, we now have a very large field of products jostling each other to differentiate themselves in terms of how long they can last and whether they're made from human or other cell lines and whether they're single chain, etc., etc. And of course, this is all to the good, because irrespective of the relative merits based upon evidence of some of the claims of these products, there's no question that they all represent efficacious, safe, recombinant factor VIII recombinant concentrates, and therefore we are very happy to have more in the potential supply pool, and as I shall perhaps intimate later on in my second thought, more able to exert some traction on the question of price and eventual availability. Some comments about the relative claims. This is a product from a trial which I think is well known to you. This is the longer-acting FC-bound factor VIII. And you can see that on the basis of what we know is the physiological reality, that factor VIII actually doesn't exist. What exists is a complex with von Willebrand factor, and the kinetics of factor VIII is bound to the kinetics of von Willebrand factor. We don't see all that much of a difference. And in fact, if you look at, and this is an oldish paper, but I'm interested in this product because of my conflict of interest. This was a study carried out by Jerry Powell. I think I saw him this morning. And if you look at the actual half-lives of this particular plasma-derived product, you can see that it's quite interesting. It's longer than the recombinant. But be that as it may, you know, there is variability within studies. But I think the point is that in these days of individualized medicine, personalized medicine, we are concentrating a lot on the features of the product. And now, thankfully, and it's not the subject of my talk, we are concentrating more on the features of the patient. And in relation to factor IX, it's undeniable. We don't have the incubus of VWF here. It's undeniable that the new product, this is the product which is already licensed, has a longer half-life. But I was intrigued by this paper. I think it's from Len Valentino. It was presented by Barry Colvin in Italy a few weeks ago, that double dosing the normal recombinant 9, or rather the first generation recombinant 9, also gives us a similar level of a profile, in the sense that if you dose once at double the dose, it comes out to pretty much like dosing once on the basis of a longer half-life. And of course, the thing is this: once we've got recombinants, we really can't double the dose, because there's as much as you like. And of course, we can discuss the issues of potential clinical safety and thrombogenicity and so on. we will need more and more product. This is a study from from Kathleen's group, and you can see that basically, and I've shown this many times, breakthrough bleeding will only stop at 15 to 20% of basal factor VIII levels. This is a challenge because, of course, we can achieve through huge doses, respective of the kinetics, and higher trough levels, but then the question comes, what about potential thrombogenicity issues? So there is still work to be done, but we must anticipate more demand. And therefore, Willie and dear friends, I will conclude with some reflections. Our historical concerns are now assuaged, but we have to continue to be vigilant. There is no room for complacency. And people who recite the mantra of zero risk in plasma products or any other kind of medicine, including the stuff I took this morning for my hangover, are very foolish. Medicines are always going to have adverse events. And the adverse events which we can expect from biological materials will always be involving infection in ways which we cannot predict. We can expect that demand for factor VIII will continue to grow as new therapeutic targets evolve. I never stop telling people that when I started on this field, 1 IU per capita was nirvana. I can remember Inga Marie Nilsson proudly writing in Thrombosis and Diathesis Hemorrhagica that Sweden had 0.7 IUs per capita and was giving full prophylaxis. Think about it. Think about it. Sweden. And therefore, if we are going to have an increase in demand, we're going to have to resist any efforts to curtail supply. And I want to round off now by some other personal remarks. And I want to thank the World Federation, which has always invited me to these forums. This is the 9th forum since the year 2000. I've spoken at all of them. This meeting is very dear to me. And on this occasion, as in always, when I come to this finest of Canadian cities, I remember my old friend and comrade who first gave me my first opportunity at this meeting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Fabulous talk as always. I think we'll take about five minutes of questions with Albert, and then we can, if we time at the end of my diatribe, we can take some more. So any questions directly to Albert at this stage? There are microphones at this side. Is there a roving mic? Sorry,
I wonder why we're still talking about anti-derived products when we have so many opportunities now with recombinant and better varieties of recombinations to make all that we need. I speak as someone whose vision was synthetic factor for all back in 1984.
Yes, well, it's a great question, Ted, and I share your view. But I think that we still do have some areas of clinical use, like tolerization and so on, where there's still a debate. And it is the case that we can still generate coagulation factors from plasma because of the particular economics. It can be done relatively cheaply, and there is a great need throughout the world. I don't think that this is a bridge which we should burn just now. Hey, it's Julie Burkover.
Great talk as always. I listened carefully as always to my great friend and professor, and you spoke about the shift in focus from concentrating on the features of the product, concentrating on the features of the patient, kind of this trend towards personalized medicine. And I was wondering with regard to availability, particularly thinking outside of first world countries, where do you see the challenges and the struggles, and in a perfect world, what would you see as necessary to provide that personalized access to patients?
Yes. stop closing down hemophilia treatment centers. There is a tendency in many parts of the world, particularly the richer countries, that since we are giving patients to dose themselves at home these extremely expensive products, we don't need hemophilia treatment centers and doctors and nurses anymore. That is extremely foolish, particularly because of this current era where we are seeing the potential. Now, I am happy that this is happening. I follow it with great interest and I'm optimistic about it, but I don't want this to become another bandwagon, this whole personalized prophylaxis thing. This is a good thing and needs to be guided properly. But now that we've got the potential, on the basis of our renewed interest in pharmacokinetics coming from the new factors and so on, to tailor patient to product, I think that we need to have very strong infrastructure, at least for the next few years, to actually achieve this, and to make sure that clinical outcomes are geared towards the individual patient. And later on, I will challenge the epidemiologists into how this can be fitted into the EBM paradigm.
Albert, great talk as always. In your comments about viral inactivation, I agree that this, is the thing that we rely upon for safety products. And you mentioned in passing about the issue of viral inactivation with regard to blood transfusion components. And most of the arguments I've heard about that go along economic lines. And I'm just wondering if, are there other technologies that can be applied to the plasma-derived products that aren't being for economic reasons, or are there just not any other technologies available that can provide that extra bit we need for the non-viral viruses that you mentioned?
Well, I don't know. I mean, does anybody know of any? I think we have a very high level of technologies which certainly, I think, take care of any breakthrough. And I'm not saying that there is breakthrough because, we have several barriers. We do not consider that the plasma which we feed into the system has any viruses because we have so many processes in place. And the important thing is that, we as an industry exceed the regulatory requirements. We have industry standards which are called voluntary, but all the industry, at least the commercial side of the industry, follows. And I really honestly think we're doing all that can be done. I do not see any impediment coming from financial causes. And this is because our sector, the plasma derivative sector, was kind of the crucible in which this happened, and in which the disasters of the 70s to 90s happened. And I think that there is a firm determination that this won't happen again. I am very concerned about the question of the whole blood sector, because as I've tried to point out, we cannot predict many of the things which happen to us. And although people might think it won't happen again, I cheerfully anticipate that it will. And therefore, not introducing what are now effective technologies, even in part, because this is the excuse I hear. Well, we know we can do it for platelets and we can sort of do it for plasma, but we can't do it for red cells, so let's not do it for anything. Now, it's actually interesting, this argument, because this was the very thing which processes like the IOM, the Institute of Medicine report, which you'll be familiar with in the United States, and the Crever Commission in this country condemned the attempt to cover all bases and find a universal solution and not move until that happens. This is what I think is really impacting on the whole blood sector. My friend here, who's a senior member of the blood sector, and the other people in the audience might wish to comment. But I think it's a very regrettable thing. But from the point of view of the plasma industry, I think that whatever needs to be done is currently being done. I would hope that more can be done to once and for all eliminate the problem of non-enveloped viruses, because I think that this is still a challenge. I know that we can eliminate through fractionation. I know we can pose barriers like nanofiltration.